I installed a gate at my house and ended up having a K-9 unit sicked on me by our power-hungry HOA enforcer Mrs. Peterson. But she had no idea my dad's the chief of police who'd come home early that day. What would you do if you watched your neighbor's illegal private security force get taken down by the exact authority they were pretending to have? Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. It all started with a simple black metal gate. You know, the kind that slides open smoothly when you press a button? I saved up for months to install it, mostly because people kept using my driveway to turn around, leaving tire marks everywhere. My dad, being chief of police, always taught me to handle problems the right way. So I checked all the rules, got the permits, and even picked a design that matched our neighborhood's style. But Mrs. Peterson next door? She turned it into World War III. I first noticed her taking pictures of my driveway while I was watering my plants. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Just standing there in her perfectly pressed tennis outfit, holding up her phone like she was documenting a crime scene. When I waved and asked if everything was okay, she just huffed and speed-walked back to her house, her designer sneakers clicking on the sidewalk. The next day, I found a bright yellow notice stuck to my mailbox. Urgent, unauthorized modification, HOA violation. I couldn't believe my eyes. The gate had been up for less than 48 hours. And already Mrs. Peterson, our neighborhood's self-appointed HOA enforcer, was on the attack. I tried talking to her like a normal person. Walking over to her house that evening, I brought the approval papers and even some homemade cookies, my mom's recipe for keeping the peace. But before I could even ring the doorbell, her security camera's speaker crackled to life. "I'm documenting everything," Mrs. Peterson's voice announced through the speaker. "That gate is reducing our property values. The HOA board will hear about this at tomorrow's emergency meeting." Emergency meeting? Over a gate? I called my dad for advice, but he was away at a police conference in Denver. "Just keep your cool," he said. "Document everything. Mrs. Peterson's been pulling stunts like this since before you were born. Remember when she tried to fine the Johnsons for having a basketball hoop? What I didn't know then was that Mrs. Peterson had been busy. Really busy. While I was installing my gate, she'd been rallying the neighbors against me, walking door to door with a petition, showing zoomed-in photos of my eyesore gate, and spreading rumors that I was planning to turn my house into some kind of business. Later that night, my security camera pinged. There was Mrs. Peterson again, this time with 2 other HOA board members, measuring my driveway in the dark with flashlights. They were whispering and pointing, probably plotting their next move. I started recording on my phone, trying not to laugh at how ridiculous they looked skulking around with their measuring tape. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In Mrs. Peterson's hand was a business card for Elite HOA Enforcement Solutions. I zoomed in on my security camera footage and Googled the company. What I found sent chills down my spine. They were a private security firm known for aggressive tactics, and they had their own K-9 unit. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from Mrs. Peterson. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Attendance mandatory. Bring your checkbook. Fines start at $500 per day." I looked out my window at the gate I'd worked so hard to install. It stood there, gleaming under the streetlights, perfectly aligned with all the HOA guidelines. What I didn't know then was that this gate would become the center of a neighborhood war. And Mrs. Peterson had no idea who she was really messing with. As I headed to bed, my security camera pinged one last time. Mrs. Peterson was back. But this time she wasn't alone. A man in what looked like a security uniform was with her, writing in a notebook and nodding at whatever she was saying. They both looked up at my camera, and I swear Mrs. Peterson smiled. The kind of smile that says checkmate. Little did she know I had an ace up my sleeve. But would Dad make it back from Denver in time before Mrs. Peterson's private security force turned our quiet neighborhood into a battleground? I woke up to the sound of camera clicks outside my window. There was Mrs. Peterson, taking pictures of my gate at 7 a.m. like it was evidence at a crime scene. But this time, she brought backup. Her whole social circle from the HOA board was there, all 5 of them in their matching pastel cardigans, shaking their heads in disapproval. My phone buzzed with an emergency HOA meeting text. Perfect timing, just when Dad was away at his police conference. I spent the morning digging through my files, finding the property maps and HOA guidelines. I'd studied before installing the gate. I knew I was right. But Mrs. Peterson had a way of twisting rules until they bent to her will. Walking into the community center that evening felt like entering a courtroom where the judge, jury, and executioner all played bridge together every Tuesday. The room was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors at an HOA meeting before. Mrs. Peterson must have promised them quite a show. "This unauthorized gate is just the beginning," Mrs. Peterson announced, pointing to her PowerPoint presentation titled, The decline of our community standards. She'd edited my gate photos to look darker, more threatening somehow. Next thing you know, people will be painting their houses purple and parking RVs in their driveways. I stood up, property maps in hand. Actually, according to Section 7.3 of our bylaws, automatic gates are permitted as long as they match the home's exterior and don't exceed 8 feet in height. Mine is exactly 7 feet, 2 inches and perfectly matches my house trim. The room got quiet. Mrs. Peterson's face turned red, but she wasn't done. She pulled out a thick folder. I've documented 37 instances of this gate disrupting the peace. Headlights reflecting, motors humming, metal squeaking. She passed around photos of my gate taken at every possible angle, even one at midnight with a timestamp. I pulled out my phone and played a video of Mrs. Peterson's sprinklers, running at 3 a.m., hitting my windows. Speaking of disrupting the peace, would anyone like to discuss water conservation bylaws? That's when she dropped her bomb. The board has already voted. We've hired West Valley Security Services. They're a professional HOA enforcement team. They'll handle this situation properly. She smiled that smile that made her look like a cat who just cornered a mouse. I almost laughed. Private security? For a gate dispute? But then Bob from 2 doors down spoke up. They're serious professionals. My cousin's HOA used them. They've got patrol cars, uniforms, even K-9 units. The meeting ended with a warning. Remove the gate within 48 hours, or face the consequences. I drove home thinking this was just another one of Mrs. Peterson's power trips. She'd tried to force the Williams family to remove their basketball hoop last summer, but she'd backed down eventually. As I pulled into my driveway that night, I noticed unfamiliar tire tracks in front of my house. Under my porch light, I found a business card tucked into my doorframe. West Valley Security Services, HOA Enforcement Division. On the back, someone had written, "First warning." Little did they know, I'd already started my own research into this security company. One quick search showed they had a history of complaints in other neighborhoods. But before I could dig deeper, I saw something that made my blood run cold. 3 black patrol cars turning onto our street, light bars glowing in the darkness. I was sipping my morning coffee when I heard the growling. Not just any growling, the deep trained bark of a police K-9 unit. My hands shook as I peeked through the blinds, and what I saw made my jaw drop. 3 black SUVs with HOA enforcement, painted on the sides, had surrounded my driveway. Mrs. Peterson stood there in her pressed, beige pantsuit, holding up her phone to record everything while a German shepherd strained against its leash. "This is your final warning," shouted a man in a mock police uniform. "Remove this unauthorized gate within the next hour, or we'll be forced to take action." The dog lunged forward, making me jump back from the window. I couldn't believe this was happening over a simple automatic gate that matched every other one in the neighborhood, except it was black instead of brown. I grabbed my phone and started recording too. My hands were shaking, but I managed to zoom in on their badges. Something looked off about them. The metal wasn't catching the sunlight like real badges should. 3 years of working at Dad's precinct during college had taught me that much. "Ma'am, we have reports of multiple violations," the lead officer called out, pounding on my front door. I could hear Mrs. Peterson's shrill voice in the background. "I told you she's been defiant for weeks. Just look at how that hideous gate ruins our property values." I opened my laptop and quickly pulled up the county's security contractor database. Just as I suspected, no licensed K-9 units, registered for private security work in our entire district. My heart was racing, but now I felt a surge of confidence. They were bluffing, and I had proof. The pounding on my door grew louder. "This is your last chance before we release the dog." Through my security camera, I could see neighbors gathering on their lawns, phones out, whispering to each other. Mrs. Peterson was practically bouncing with excitement, her perfectly styled gray hair bobbing as she narrated everything for her video. I grabbed the property maps I'd printed out weeks ago when this all started, showing that my gate was fully within my property line. Then I dialed Dad's number, praying he'd pick up even though he was supposed to be at that conference 3 states away. The K-9 handler was unclipping the dog's leash when I heard it. The familiar rumble of Dad's police cruiser turning onto our street. Mrs. Peterson was so busy filming my door, she didn't even notice him pulling up behind the SUVs. Lights flashing. "This is Chief Williams." Dad's voice boomed through his cruiser's speaker. "All unauthorized security personnel, stand down immediately." The look on Mrs. Peterson's face was better than any Christmas present I'd ever gotten. Her phone actually slipped from her fingers as she spun around, her mouth hanging open like a fish. The fake officers froze, and their dog sat down immediately. At least they'd trained it well enough for that. I stepped onto my porch, holding up my phone that was still recording. "Mrs. Peterson, I believe you and your hired helpers here are in violation of County Code 47.3. impersonating law enforcement and operating an unlicensed K-9 unit. Would you like to see the documentation? 2 real police cars pulled up behind Dad's cruiser. And now Mrs. Peterson was backing away, stammering about how she was just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. The fake officers were already putting their hands up, probably realizing how much trouble they were in. Their German Shepherd looked confused, glancing between its handler and the real police as if trying to figure out who to obey. But this wasn't over yet. As Dad stepped out of his cruiser, straightening his chief's uniform, Mrs. Peterson's face suddenly hardened. She reached into her designer purse, and I saw her pull out something that made my blood run cold. Actual HOA papers with the county seal. I couldn't believe my eyes when Dad's police cruiser pulled up. His conference wasn't supposed to end for 2 more days. Mrs. Peterson's face turned ghost white as she watched him step out in his full chief uniform, his gold badge catching the morning sun. The fake security team suddenly looked less sure of themselves, and their German Shepherd even stopped barking. "What's going on here?" Dad's voice boomed across my driveway. Before anyone could answer, he spotted the K-9 unit and his eyes narrowed. Who authorized a police dog in my jurisdiction? The lead security officer stumbled over his words. "Sir, we're from Elite HOA Enforcement, hired by the Homeowners Association to show me your K-9 unit license." Dad cut him off, pulling out his phone. "And your security company credentials." Mrs. Peterson tried to slip away, but Dad noticed. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay right there. We have some questions about who hired unlicensed security to intimidate my family." I pulled up the videos. I'd been recording of Mrs. Peterson's harassment over the past weeks on my phone. The way she'd blast her sprinklers onto my driveway every morning. How she'd shine bright lights into my windows at night. And all those times she'd called fake noise complaints on me. The lead security officer was sweating now. Mrs. Peterson assured us this was all approved by local law enforcement. Dad scrolled through something on his phone. "That's interesting because I'm looking at our county's licensed security database right now. Elite HOA Enforcement isn't even registered as a company here. Those uniforms you're wearing? That's impersonating law enforcement officers." 2 police cruisers rounded the corner, their lights flashing. I recognized Officers Martinez and Johnson. They'd been over for our family barbecues. The fake security team started backing up towards their vehicles. But Dad's voice stopped them cold. "Nobody moves. Those officers are here because I just reported armed individuals impersonating law enforcement. Mrs. Peterson, I'm especially interested in these receipts my department just found, showing you paid this illegal operation with HOA funds." Mrs. Peterson finally lost her cool. "This is ridiculous. He's breaking HOA rules with that gate. I'm protecting our property values." I pulled out the property maps and HOA guidelines I'd studied. "Actually, Mrs. Peterson, there's nothing in the HOA rules against security gates. I checked every page. But there are rules against using HOA funds without board approval. Did you get approval for hiring these guys?" The color drained from her face as my neighbors started coming outside to watch. Someone was live streaming everything on our neighborhood Facebook group. The fake security team's German Shepherd whined and sat down, clearly sensing the shift in power. Dad turned to Officers Martinez and Johnson. "Book them for impersonating law enforcement. And Mrs. Peterson needs to come down to the station to explain how HOA funds were used to hire an illegal security force." As they led everyone away in handcuffs, I noticed Mr. Wilson, the HOA board president, watching from his porch. His face told me Mrs. Peterson's reign of terror was finally over. But something told me this wasn't the end. There were probably more HOA residents who'd been bullied by her, and their stories were about to come out. I watched in amazement as my dad took control of the situation, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. The fake security team's faces turned pale when he started checking their credentials on his phone. Mrs. Peterson tried to slip away, but Dad's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Ma'am, you'll want to stay for this." Within minutes, real police cars arrived, their lights flashing. My neighbors came out of their houses, phones recording everything. The K-9 handler couldn't produce proper certification, and their vehicle registration showed they weren't even a real security company, just a group of wannabe cops Mrs. Peterson had hired from a sketchy online ad. Dad discovered they'd been threatening other homeowners too, collecting fake fines and keeping the money. One of my elderly neighbors, Mrs. Rodriguez, came forward crying. She'd paid them $500 last month for having wind chimes that Mrs. Peterson said were too noisy. The truth spread through our neighborhood like wildfire. Someone found Mrs. Peterson's social media posts, bragging about how she'd clean up the neighborhood her way. The local news showed up just as the fake security team was being handcuffed. Mrs. Peterson screamed about her authority and reputation, but nobody was listening anymore. At the emergency HOA meeting that night, people shared stories I couldn't believe. Mrs. Peterson had been running our neighborhood, like her personal kingdom for years. She'd forced a single mom to repaint her house 3 times in one summer. She'd made a veteran take down his small American flag because it wasn't the right shade of red. The HOA board voted her out on the spot. As she stormed out, she slipped on the wet grass, right into the mud by her precious flower bed. I wanted to laugh, but honestly, I just felt sorry for her. All that power-hungry behavior had left her with nothing but a court date and 0 friends. The next few weeks were amazing. Our new HOA board, led by Mrs. Rodriguez, focused on actually helping neighbors. They approved my gate design and even used it as a model for new security guidelines. Other neighbors started installing similar gates, turning Mrs. Peterson's complaint into a neighborhood trend. The fake security team faced serious charges for impersonating law enforcement. But the biggest shock came during their court hearing. They revealed text messages showing Mrs. Peterson had specifically told them to be aggressive and scare people into compliance. She'd even given them a list of neighbors to target, mostly families she thought wouldn't fight back. Dad made sure the story reached the state HOA Oversight Committee. They launched an investigation into power abuse in other neighborhoods too. My little gate problem had uncovered a whole network of HOA bullies across the county. The funniest part? My dad did install a new gate at his house, but instead of doing it to spite Mrs. Peterson, he turned it into a neighborhood security workshop. He invited everyone to learn about real home security from actual police officers. Even Mrs. Peterson's husband came, telling us quietly that he'd always thought his wife had gone too far. Today, my gate still stands as a reminder that standing up to bullies works, especially when you do it the right way. Mrs. Peterson moved away last month, but before she left, I caught her taking pictures of my gate again. This time, though, she was looking up companies to install one at her new house. Sometimes the best revenge is showing someone a better way to live.